from West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Support for the Legislature Today is provided by the following.
The West Virginia Higher Education Policy Commission, working with students and families to improve college access and student success for a better West Virginia. West Virginia University, online at wvu.edu.
Good evening, I'm Andrea Lanham, and we're live from the Capitol building in Charleston for the special hour-long broadcast of the Legislature Today, with just one day to go in the 2018 legislative session. I'll be joined by fellow State House reporters a little later in the program for a look back at the major issues that unfolded here in the last 2 months. But first, the 2019 state budget. Joining me now are House Finance Chair Eric Nelson and House Minority Vice Chair Mick Bates. Senior reporter Dave Mistich also joins the discussion as well. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight.
Great to see you here.
So the House passed its budget last night following the rejection of several different amendments, but there are some differences between the House's version and the Senate. Can you kind of go into those differences?
Sure, and we'll handle those here in about 15 minutes or so. The main ones, primarily a couple of small little line items, but the big ones are in the back part of the budget. It's called the General Revenue Surplus. And to the extent that we have any extra cash at the end of this fiscal year, which is June 30th, we have 5 or 6 items back there that would be funded. Those are $5 million to an opioid project, $2.5 million to tourism, $2.5 million to commerce, some money for stream gauges to help with our flooding, and $2 million to volunteer fire departments unemployment. But other than that, they're very similar.
So you're still pretty much on the same page as the Senate?
Yes, yes.
Now, I know there were some questions, there were a lot of questions last night regarding the $58 million in revised revenue estimates. And I remember you saying this is for next year. That's correct?
Yes, you know, so the governor did provide us an adjustment letter, which is standard here in the last week of session. And in his adjustment letter, there were various expenditure changes, but there was also an additional $58 million that we all know about or have heard about that he raised revenue. We in the House nor in the Senate used that extra 58 in our budget at this time. And our plan would be as we look into the next fiscal year, which starts in July, and should our economy be better and revenues come in above estimates, we'll utilize those maybe during an interim session, a special session, or even this time next year during regular session.
Now, I know the plan last night was to suspend the rules on the Senate's budget, but that ended up not happening because didn't have the votes to do that. But I know that Democrats had some concerns about the bill. Delegate Bates, can you go into some of those concerns?
Well, I think the issue here and where we got into some discussion, to use I think the right word, was that the speed of the changes that occurred. So we'd passed a budget out of finance that actually did include that $58 million that the chairman had brought forward and had laid that over multiple days. And that was the document that we were working with. So our minority caucus was looking at the budget through those eyes. Now, as part of the negotiation, I understand, between Senate leadership and House leadership, the decision was made to not use that $58 million. That came off the table. So when that came off the table, then we had to reconfigure in terms of what we were doing. So our members had not had a lot of time to look at the new proposal, and we were uncomfortable moving forward until we had a chance to look at some side-by-side documents, and the chairman was able to provide us with some of those. We had a difference of opinion or philosophy. We believe that if there are excess funds that are available at the back of the budget from this current fiscal year, that we should allocate those. We shouldn't just leave those there. And we have some different priorities. So there was an effort to try to take care of some issues in higher education, some other places, some things that were in the original budget that came out of health finance. So we spent a couple of hours discussing that back and forth, and we didn't prevail. And what we have is what we have. And I think this evening we'll try to sync up those two versions of the document, and potentially we'll be done.
I want to jump in here, just a question of how the House sort of turned to not using the $58 million. As you pointed out, that was the budget that you guys were operating on. I guess that's a direct result of the negotiations with the Senate as in terms of this teacher pay increase and the state employee
Let's just step back where we were a week ago.
Right.
And at that time, we didn't have any pay raise that had been approved. The House had a version that was at 5% for various pay groups, including the teachers or school personnel, I should say. And we were thinking in terms of a 3% for state employees. The Senate all along wanted, I think, equal and fair pay raises for everybody. And they were at 4% and ultimately came up to 5%. And so the difference is in the $58 million and how that's handled. And yes, our initial House budget did utilize that $58 million and put money to many areas that we thought were in need, especially after the last few years, especially higher education. So anyway, at the end, the negotiation to get a deal done and show how important our state employees are. I mean, this is the largest pay raise, I believe, in state history.
Right.
Well, and I think again, as far as we're in the minority, so we weren't part of those negotiations. So we were in the back of the bus and have to react to things that are provided to us when they occur. And I think that the chairman's budget, the House Finance budget, came down. I think it came down on a voice vote with no nays, and it was a good work product. And we're very prepared to move forward with that budget as it came down, with possibly some amendments to improve the rate of pay for state workers. But we could have lived with that. We felt that we needed to spend that $58 million. Either it's there or it's not there. And if it's not there, then that's on the governor. So that was our position, and we had, again, a discussion about the right way to proceed, and the chairman prevailed.
So let's go into some of the cuts that were necessitated by this. I understand that there are some cuts to tourism and commerce. Can you just kind of explain what those cuts are? Because I was a little confused about tourism because it looked like it was zeroed out.
So quickly, the governor's budget included $14 million for tourism. The House budget that first came out cut that down to $5 million. The ultimate product that we have is zero. Commerce was roughly at $38 million initially. We had $5 million or $10 million in the House budget. There'll be $3 million that comes in the final product. That's where most of I think our large cuts from the initial introduction went to help pay for the $50 million plus in extra pay raises that were implemented in the budget.
So tourism is zeroed out?
Well, we have, and again, tourism, I think commerce, the diversification that we need in certain areas that have great multiples, that's why they're in the back of the budget. So if we do have some general revenue surplus out of 18, that's a high priority item for us.
So there was a lot of questions yesterday about who would receive this 5% raise, people who were both funded by grants and state money, and there was also a question about the correctional officers as well, which I didn't know that they would receive the 5% plus the bill that was passed that had the 2,000, 2,000, 2,000. What is some of the processes, I know that the Democrats too, to look at some of these people who will and won't receive these pay raises?
Well, and again, some of that's a little unclear. And as the chairman knows, it's complicated because you've got people that are funded out of general revenue, you've got people that are funded out of special revenue accounts, you've got people that are funded out of state road. So, I think the message out there right now is everybody gets 5%. The first thing people need to realize it's not 5%. And we say this over and over and over again. It's a fixed dollar amount. But that general revenue has been allocated in the budget, and we understand that the governor is going to direct the people that in administration to try to make that flow through to everybody, but that's not something necessarily we have control over. So there are some unanswered questions about who's going to get this or who isn't going to get this, and it wasn't until yesterday that we found out well, perhaps the day before, that we found out that the 5% and the raise, the correctional officer's raise, was going to be combined. So it's all moving very quickly.
We all caught a lot of emails, and the questions came out, well, do I qualify or not?
Yeah.
So.
Another question I've heard, and maybe you can answer this right now, is higher education employees, are they included in that 5% raise? Or?
Yes, those that are in the general revenue portion of the budget.
Right.
And that was where some of our efforts were last night in terms of trying to bump some money towards for higher ed, because there are people in higher ed that aren't funded through general revenue. And we're concerned that there's going to be some pressure on our higher education institutions to be able to come up with the money to do that. So that was some of the motivation for what you saw last night.
And, and some of the, I guess, hurried nature of going from the governor's plan of 1% all the way up to 5%, that's a rather big jump, and puts additional pressure on our higher education institutions. Some have the other resources that they can go to. Others aren't quite as fortunate. So,
I mean, are they going to have to deal with tuition hikes because of this, or are we going to see any implications of that?
I think we'll hear more as this unveils itself.
Sure.
And if there's something that's needed as the new fiscal year materializes, I'm sure that we'll work to address that as quickly as we can.
Sure.
So one thing I was curious about is the House's plan to fold the Senate's version into the House version, or the House's version into the Senate's version.
Mm-hmm.
Why go with that approach instead of just pass the House version and just wait for the Senate to take it up?
This is a process that happens every year. And every year, one chamber takes responsibility for the budget. It happens to be the Senate's turn this time. And we did pass ours out last night, and so there's another option over here today for the Senate to take ours and move forward if need be. But what will happen, and we're on second reading coming up, we're going to take the Senate's version, we'll amend in our agreed to changes, then it's sent back, and then all they have to do to expedite the process is to concur. They do have the option to further amend, but should they concur, we're out of here tomorrow with a balanced budget passed by both chambers for the first time, I think, ever in the first 60 days of session.
Delegate Bates, what kind of concerns do you have with the budget as it stands right now?
Again, one of the things is I rarely do things quickly well, and particularly big things. So I think we've worked very hard to get to this point. My position is it's wise to check the lines and make sure that we've got it correct before we celebrate victory ahead of when we need to. So I'm very pleased that we're going to be able to get this budget done on time, and there's no reason to be here for a special session and no reason to have an extended series of meetings into next week with conferees. But I think we need to make sure, as we saw last week with the pay raise bill, I mean, you get one number wrong, it throws the whole thing off. So this has all come together very, very quickly in the last week, and hopefully we've got the math right and it all ties together, and we don't have to undo what we're doing. So that's a process issue. I think the original plan was to run the House budget first this year. I think it was the House's turn, and we actually moved our budget down, and then we held it on the calendar for several days until this deal was cut with the Senate. So this is a bit of a switch midstream in terms of how we're going. I do think that we needed to incorporate that $58 million into our budget and lay it back in the governor's lap, and if it's not there, it's not there. So I would have liked to have seen us, we appropriate, make those appropriations, but that was not possible as part of the negotiations that the chairman had to be involved in to get this thing across the line. So we'll
Let's not forget some of those early discussions during session and questioning revenue. So anyway,
we'll as I keep a close eye on, those revenue
just
numbers
keep
as you do.
Honest, okay.
Well, that's good. That's part of the process. We're both here to keep each other honest.
That's
so
right.
that's the way it works. That's the way it should work.
Yes, absolutely.
So but the chairman and his staff, and really a lot of that credit does need to go to the staff, and it puts an immense amount of pressure on them as well.
This is a complicated.
It's a very, very complicated process, and they work extremely hard. They're here before we are. They're here when we go home. So they deserve a lot of the effort, the credit for the effort that goes into making these things work.
So Delegate Nelson, I know that you were trying to clarify a lot of stuff as far as these Medicaid cuts go, and I remember you saying last night there's no single line item cut to DHHR. Can you just kind of explain that and just explain, maybe clear up some of the confusion as far as Medicaid cuts go?
Sure. Gosh, there are multiple line items in that Medicaid budget. I mean, gosh, it's 30-some% of our general revenue. There are no changes to any single line item from fiscal year 18. And the largest line item in the DHHR budget is medical services, over $400 million. And so what is in this budget is a cut to that line of roughly $24 million. 14 is which is being filled by lottery, so we have a hole, if you will, of $10 million. And there'll be opportunities next year as this revenue comes in, as well as other means to fill that back in. And so right now, no single program is going to be underfunded or is fully funded to the same levels as this current fiscal year.
Now, what's the plan for the rest of the day? I know you said maybe this is going to get done
out of
for
here
60.
and get some sleep. The plan. So we have a couple bills on second this budget, and then the rest of today, tonight, whatever, and then tomorrow is good. Messages going back and forth as it relates to changes to bills that we must concur or amend or agree to in some way.
Do you think it's going to get done by tomorrow?
Absolutely. Sine die, hopefully early. Wouldn't that be nice?
I want to jump in here. You know, talking about healthcare, I mean, PEIA was one of the initial conversations with the teacher strike. It's my understanding, I think $21 million from the Senate's budget is going to the Stability Fund.
Well, from both our budgets.
For both,
let's just say the budget.
The budget, yeah, right.
We'll have an additional 21. There's a total of 29 million in this budget going to the PEI Stabilization Fund. And you know, it's an interesting stat that no one's talked about. The state, we pay almost $350 million, and it comes out of general revenue into the PEIA fund.
And those monies go to pay for medical services that the state of West Virginia, the people that work for the state of West Virginia are in need of. And I'm fortunate enough to join with Delegate Nelson on the task force, and we'll be looking at these issues because they have significant fiscal impacts no matter what we do with it on our budget process moving forward. And we need to be coming up with $50 million year over year over year to be able to take care of this problem with the current rate of growth. So those are, and that's the next thing that we're sitting down to do. I think the first meeting's Tuesday. This doesn't stop, even though we get through this budget
And there were
cycle.
some measures that came across this session to deal with that on the long term, correct? Is it, I mean,
well, you know, it's very difficult to put funding sources out when you don't know what a plan is. And time again, we had many people talking about throwing money at an area, but there's no real plan in place of how to properly make the correct changes, if you will, going forward. And this task force, I think we're both looking forward to being part of that, bringing the legislative perspective to this as it relates to funding sources, and you know, have heard from all state employees of their concerns over the last few years. It's been unfortunate over the last few years that we just haven't had any resources to put towards, you know, our employee benefits until this year.
Delegate Bates, I wanted to just get your final thoughts about as we move forward with the budget and this the last day of the session.
You know, again, this has been a more settled year than it has been in previous years as far as the budget's concerned. And that's really for two reasons. One, it's improved revenue. So the revenues are there. The revenue estimate was increased by about $100 million over what we had to deal with last year. And we have $100 million worth of found money in Medicaid. And so there's about $200 million there that more to play with this year than there were last year. So this makes this job a whole lot easier. It doesn't make it easy though. So you know, I think considering all the things that are on the table, I would consider this to be a moderate success. And I hope that we're able to kind of get this thing wrapped up in a timely manner here in the next day or so and be done, and then move on to the next issue.
Well, and one thing, found money. I mean, you know, I think we've got to, you know, through different efficiencies and plan changes, I think that the DHHR is a much better managed organization. When you have a $5 billion organization, it only takes a small little efficiency change of 1 or 2% to generate some extra savings, and that's what they have done. So anyway, it's properly found money if that's the case, but and continuing to put money in the services that we need across the state. So anyway.
Well, once again, thank you both for joining us. Again, we have Delegate Eric Nelson and Delegate Mick Bates.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. The 2018 legislative session will certainly be remembered for the historic 9-day teacher strike that brought thousands to the Capitol and resulted in the passage of a 5% pay raise for teachers, school service personnel, and state troopers. And as the budget differences are worked out, the pay raise is on its way to covering all public employees. Also a result of the work stoppage, a PEIA task force has been established by the governor. Russ Barber has this recap of the sights and sounds.
There are public employees out there, and a lot of them, who have expressed a desire to strike.
Hundreds of West Virginia teachers and school service personnel braved below freezing temperatures and rallied Friday at the state capitol for better pay and benefits. While organized work stoppages came from those in Mingo, Logan, and Wyoming counties, teachers from elsewhere around the state also made their way to the Rotunda in Charleston. The rally came as the upper chamber considered Senate Bill 267, which calls for a 1% salary increase. The bill passed on a 33-0 vote and now heads to the House.
I think having that bill passed today actually gives it some more momentum to go. I think that it had to pass at 1%, but we'll see what the House does with it. If they look to increase that, I think people are not going to be okay when the pay raise that's being proposed and passed so far is going to outweigh the increases in their insurance.
Concerns over PEIA premium and deductible increases, as well as other currently proposed requirements of the insurance provider, have also stoked the flames.
Hello, my name is Rhonda Wood. I teach at Cabell Alternative School in Cabell County. I have a thirst for knowledge and I have a thirst to transport that to my students. But without support and respect, that challenge becomes greater and greater every day. And that is what teachers are asking for, is the respect and support we deserve.
Hello, I'm Stephen Justice from Logan High School. I have 5 degrees and working on my dissertation in psychology now for a PhD, and I have to work 3 jobs in order to survive. And I guarantee you, I'm better off than a lot of these other teachers out here because my things are paid for. My truck is paid for. My house is paid for. What about all these other teachers that have extra bills that I don't have?
We're witnessing something that I've never been around. The energy that's here, the enthusiasm. It's not hostile, it's very organic. So what impresses me is the younger people, kids, women, they're here and they want to be heard, and what I've been trying to tell them is that they are being heard, that because of what they've been doing, the fact that they've been coming down here, it has changed the conversation. When we came down here 4 weeks ago, we weren't even talking about these issues. PEA was set in stone, all right? They'll get a 1% increase for 1 year, all right? We've got a long way to go, but look how far we've come, and it's happened because of these people in these hallways and these people that have decided that, no, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to be heard. It's what democracy is about in its purest form.
Our teachers need to be in the classroom. The legislature's spoken and I've signed it into law. Our teachers need to be in the classroom and our kids need to be in school. And our families don't need to be having to stay home from work in order to be able to take care of this terrible disruption.
We're going to give all state personnel right now, or all state employees a 3% raise. We're going to do an additional 2% for all those that are related to education, whether it be service personnel or teachers, and we're going to do it all in the first year.
I am Jamie Hefner. I am a special education teacher at Braxton County High School. This is my 6th day here at the Capitol. I want to let the governor, legislators know that the deal he proposed yesterday, actually the deal he said we were getting yesterday, doesn't sit well with me. I came here for a purpose, and that purpose was to get PEIA fixed. And yesterday, the 5% raise, okay, but they said nothing about PEIA being funded. And that's why I'm fighting so hard, is because I want PEIA funded.
Will the Senate conduct any sort of audit of the governor's revenue numbers?
Well, certainly we're doing that always. We're looking at those numbers. We're receiving, we understand that the February numbers have come in and that we are still, at this point in the fiscal year, about $15 to $16 million behind estimates.
It's our indication that they're going to finance, take the governor's revised budget estimate of X amount of $1 million, put it into the general revenue, disperse it among all state employees, teachers, service personnel, state police, and give them an equal pay raise and make us vote on it.
Hey, I'm real pleased to report as a member of the conference committee from the Democrat side, I just finished signing and all the members of the conference committee just signed. And God willing, if everything works out, hopefully that can be on the governor's desk by the end of the day.
You are inspiring people all over this world to stand up for what's right. Thank you.
Lauren Wyatt from Sissonville High School in Kanawha County. I'm happy. I'm greatly relieved. I'm ready to get back in my classroom.
It's a great day to be a West Virginian!
For the Legislature Today, I'm Dave Mistich at the Capitol.
Joining us now to talk about the flurry of activity here at the Capitol today are Ryan Quinn of the Charleston Gazette-Mail, Jake Zuckerman also of the Charleston Gazette-Mail, and Brad McElhenney of West Virginia Metro News. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks.
So just coming off from this this package about the walkout, let's just talk about the historic nature of this. This was a 9-day walkout. This completely changed the atmosphere of the legislative session. Brad, I'll start with you, just talking about the walkout and just how it completely changed the atmosphere here.
Well, first of all, the last few days have been very lonely and so quiet, because we were, you know, if we had been taping this the last couple of weeks, honestly, there would have been probably teachers walking through. They were chanting, they were singing, sometimes they were dancing, holding signs, filling the galleries, and it was just an incredible presence of members of the public here. They came to know the legislative process very well, they came to know the players, and so in terms of atmosphere, it was very different, but it also really changed the conversation. If you had asked me what the big issues were going to be going into the session, I would have said probably the Supreme Court stuff that wound up happening, the controversies over Supreme Court spending that erupted right before the session began, and natural gas issues, which also went through, but without nearly as much controversy. Just the teachers overwhelmed all of that. That ended abruptly middle of this week, and since then it's kind of felt like epilogue ever since.
I wanted to get your take on that too, Jake.
Yeah, I'd very much agree with that. Everything feels like it kind of peaked, and now we're just working our way out of this, for one. But yeah, it's been quiet. I'm still getting over tinnitus from just the steady roar. I mean, I'm still getting used to hearing myself think. But yeah, now it just seems to be trying to scramble to get all this stuff done that we had kind of forgotten about for the, what was it, 13, 12 calendar days that the teachers were here. You know, there are all these bills that we're just trying to jam through because everything teachers just kind of sucked up all the air out of the room, and everything was teachers, 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 and now we're just remembering that there's this whole world of policy outside of that.
Ryan, talk about some of the emotional changes that happened as well, because at first it was a lot of anger, and then there was a lot of happiness and more cheerfulness there toward the end.
Yeah, when last week, Tuesday evening, when Justice had his now infamous, news conference where he didn't take questions from reporters other than the ones that Jake shouted at him, and then went off to coach a basketball game. He announced this deal and for 5% raises for teachers and school service personnel for the next fiscal year, and he and the state union leaders said it was going to end things and asked people to return to classrooms to end the strike as of Thursday of last week.
For a cooling off day.
Yeah, and the Wednesday was supposed to be a cooling off day. Well, it was not a cooling off day. People continued to strike. And then come Wednesday of this week, there were no teachers in the Capitol, none that I saw at least. There was no chanting. There certainly weren't thousands of them. They actually did return to their classrooms, and that was largely after they accepted the same sort of deal that Justice had proposed that Tuesday evening of last week. The 5% raise was extended to state employees who were previously promised just a 3%, and there was also put into through an executive order, the task force to study PEIA was actually established, and that seemed to have actually tamped down some of the concerns of teachers. That by the time the strike actually ended, there was jubilation, and several times Country Roads was sang by the crowds.
Now, Ryan, I know that you've been covering too just how the days will be made up. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so State School Superintendent Payne actually had a conference call yesterday with reporters to explain, what he was going to do, and honestly, I was thinking, due to the bill signing comments by Governor Justice when he actually signed the 5% raise bill, it sounded like he was getting at that he was going to request the state superintendent actually ensure flexibility, and by that he seemed to be getting at help for days to not have to be made up due to the strike. Superintendent Payne said, yes, they are going to have to be made up, but that requirement is not as strict for not as strict for students as it is for workers. He specifically said that students can get excused absences for planned family vacations. So a lot of schools or a lot of school systems are going to technically, according to Payne, cancel their spring breaks, but that may mean that the workers are going to be there, but a lot of students may be allowed, it's a county by county decision, to actually have excused absences for vacations during that time.
Have you heard any reaction to that plan at all?
I mean, when I asked my question of the governor actually at the press conference with a bunch of what seemed to be school employees behind me, and I suggested that it could be more academically damaging to students if these days aren't made up, there were expressions of discontent with that. It seemed like the school workers, at least in that room, did not agree with that. But as far as more recent feedback, Kanawha County just gave their plan today as far as what they're going to do, so I don't know the feedback to that yet, and I haven't been able to gather the feedback to other county plans like Putnam's, which was released yesterday, since Payne's press conference yesterday.
Gotcha. Now switching gears to what all has happened today, there's been quite a few bills to run through both the House and Senate. Brad, I know you've been covering the SNAP bill. Can you just kind of talk about what happened with that and just kind of give a recap about what that is?
Yeah, you're right. Although, going back to our earlier point about the teacher strike capturing all of our attention, there are all these bills that have popped up today that are like, oh, I remember you. SNAP being one of them. And I think Jake was at a committee meeting last night that bill changed in some significant ways, but essentially counties have been able to get waivers if they have high unemployment rates for requirements that people work, and even that is only certain people. The disabled, those with children are exempt, but in any case, West Virginia will be potentially imposing work requirements or volunteering requirements for people who receive what's broadly known as food stamps. Maybe you can explain what happened in that committee meeting.
Yeah, if I could jump in here.
Yeah.
In the House-passed version of the bill, so along with certain economic triggers that say for counties that are underperforming economically and the unemployment rates are just too high, you can still continue to receive federal exemptions from these work requirements. But in October of 2021, that's done, and the work requirements are generally done. So if you are not working 20 hours a week, and work actually counts as volunteering or workforce training, but if you're not performing any of those for 20 hours a week, you can only receive food stamps or the SNAP benefits for 3 months. But the Senate amended that bill with 2 Republican senators on the committee joining in to say that the 2021 provision is done, so there will be no statewide implementation of these work requirements. So what that basically means is any, let's say, economically prosperous or any county where there are enough jobs, the work requirements will take effect. But for some of the counties that are hurting, especially in the southern parts of the state, it's not likely that those work requirements will take effect anytime soon. That being said, the Senate has passed Bill A, the House has passed Bill B. They're going to have to find a way to reconcile what's a pretty big change.
Well, as you mentioned, the Senate did pass that today. Let's take a listen to some of the debate that happened earlier.
Sure.
It's suggested by the department that this would impact about potentially 14,000 people. And again, there is some volunteerism potential for them. But there are some places that it's going to be hard for these people to volunteer. There are situations that I'm not sure members of this body see on a regular basis where you simply can't just go out get in your car, drive somewhere, volunteer because they don't have a car. If they had a car, they wouldn't have insurance, etc. If there were 7,000 people impacted, that would translate into about $17 million less food stamps or SNAP benefits to West Virginia. And those $17 million are SNAP benefits that are used in lots of rural areas, areas that there might be only one little store there. It's a mom and pop store. And these folks are going to be impacted. And I worry about whether they can even stay open. And therefore, we have even more of food deserts. So again, as well as intentioned as it is, I just think there's some potential negative impacts. And we're going to be losing a lot of federal funding for this. And I would urge a no vote.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just rise in support of the bill. I think what we're trying to do is take a very hard look to not try to penalize anybody, certainly anybody that needs the benefits. I think it was said in testimony yesterday by the department that probably 85% of able-bodied adults don't even qualify to be looked at because they do have issues that my good friend from the senator from Boone discussed. They've placed extraordinary amount of provisions in there to the point that I think even in testimony yesterday it said you could go just next door and cut the grass for an elderly neighbor and they could write a note saying that you helped out. So there were a lot of provisions in there, and this the bill intent is to reduce fraud. I think we saw that just in the past couple of years there was over 8,000 cases where people were going multi-state getting SNAP benefits throughout different states. So trying to cut down on the fraud, keep the money to where it can help our citizens, certainly the ones that need it the most, and keep it in their households, and I would urge passage of the bill.
And Jake, this passed the Senate today, correct?
Yeah, it passed pretty easily, and now it's up to the House to either take the changes or stand their ground, which would probably lead to a conference committee.
Now, switching gears a little bit again, Ryan, you've been covering this bill to dismantle the education and arts. Can you just kind of explain briefly what this bill will do? I know it does a lot of different things.
Yeah, there's a hodgepodge of programs within Department of Education and the Arts, and this bill would, in that department, erase the position of the Cabinet Secretary, which is currently held by Gail Manchin, wife of U.S. Senator Joe Manchin, and then send all of the agencies to different parts of state government, make some of them actually independent agencies, put some of them in commerce and things like that, like the Division of Rehabilitation Services would actually be in commerce. And generally it would just send these agencies to different areas.
Let's take a listen to what happened in the Senate earlier today with the debate on this bill.
These people are concerned that what we're about to do is going to jeopardize some of the most important grants that we have in this state, ones that take care of the feeding of small children throughout the summer, where they have no other ability to get any food. We've talked about it during the teacher pay raise issue, that when school wasn't in, kids don't get breakfast and lunch. We have people with disabilities whose funds and services could get cut off for any length of time would be disastrous. Now, I'm not standing here because I give one damn about any political person involved in this debate, and by God, I hope nobody else in this room is either. The people who are involved in the programs say it's a 6-month process at a minimum. We're giving them 3. Ladies and gentlemen, I request, I really ask you to search your souls. And if you have any doubt that the Department of Education can immediately take over these programs and continue them without a bump in the road, then vote as you're going to vote anyways. But if you have any doubt, vote no on this bill. Thank you.
The more I study it and review it, the more fear I have if this bill passes. First of all, it's not broken. If this bill passes, we're not going to shine the light on arts and humanities and culture that West Virginia is so steeped in and has been so successful.
Thank you, Mr. President. In light of some of the comments and information shared by my colleagues across the aisle, I would request unanimous consent that House Bill 4006 be moved to the foot of bills on third reading.
Is there objection? Chair hears none, so ordered.
Now, Ryan, as we just heard, that was moved to the foot of the calendar for today. What happened when they took it up later this evening?
Well, it passed. They took it back up about 4:25 p.m. and it passed by a hair, I think, 2 votes or something like that. The discrepancy that Fern said was the reason that he delayed a vote was that Heather Foster, who is the head of Volunteer West Virginia, said that she had concerns about the possible impact of the bill on federal funding for that Energy Express program. Earlier this week, State School Superintendent Steve Payne, whose Department of Education, which is separate from the Department of Education and the Arts, had written a letter to Senate President Mitch Carmichael saying that Foster and another person did not actually have concerns about the loss of federal funding for Energy Express. And so there is this big discrepancy there, and I still don't know, I still haven't heard from Payne today about how exactly that occurred. Foster and then the other person he referenced, Matthew Beatty, both said that they did have continuing concerns, but apparently after Senator Weld spoke to Payne sometime this afternoon after that bill was delayed, that vote was delayed, senators felt confident enough to bring it back up, and they actually just passed it. Now has to go back over to the House so the House can agree with amendments made to it by the Senate.
Now, Brad, I know that you've been covering this as well. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add to everything that Ryan's explained?
Well, just the next step I think is fascinating. It potentially goes to the governor. So first of all, this is a department underneath his realm. Furthermore, last year when there were quite a few things being cut, the governor's response would be, why do we in West Virginia think that we don't deserve things? And now I wonder, may he say that kind of thing about education and the arts? Why do we in West Virginia not need education and the arts? There is, of course, a political aspect of this, which is the head of the Education and the Arts Department is Gail Manchin, wife of U.S. Senator Joe Manchin. That was referenced by Senator Romano in the clip. So is there an aspect of Governor Justice's decision that may be swayed one way or another by that? Certainly not the full decision, but might there be some aspect of it?
Right. Now, another thing that the Senate had taken up, and Jake, I know you've been covering this pretty extensively, is the bill that creates 100 single-member districts, and that passed today. Just tell me a little bit about your coverage on this issue and what happens next.
Right, so the bill's been on kind of a roller coaster, and it played out the same in both chambers in that the bill says when they redraw the districts after the census in 2020, instead of this kind of wonky process of having certain districts that have more than one member where voters will actually pick a couple of different delegates to represent them, we're just going to draw 100 single-member districts. And in the House passing that bill, they also assigned a subcommittee to draft a separate bill that says instead of having politicians draw these district lines, which can lead to a couple of problems and a clever redrawing of the lines can give them an edge conceivably, we're going to have an independent commission draw these lines. And what that would look like and how that would play out, change shape, but first in a House subcommittee, after spending weeks on it, it was kind of railroaded at the last minute, and a watered down version of that bill came out, and that bill itself never made it out of the House, but the single member district bill did, which then came over to the Senate, and in the Senate, Senator Stephen Baldwin from Greenbrier tried a similar thing, which came into some procedural problems, but at the end of the day, he also tried to form this independent commission. It was also voted down in committee, but I believe the bill passed today. If not, it's on track for passage, and it looks like it's going to pass. So come 2020, there are going to be single-member districts in West Virginia, assuming Governor Jim Justice signs onto the bill. The question will be in future years if there's any legislative will to bring back this idea of having independent, I don't want to say politicians, but independent entities draw these district lines.
One thing that kind of struck me too is that in the House there was a lot of debate, and if I remember right, it lasted for hours, but in the Senate there was no real comment or argument. And I realize that it doesn't really affect the Senate all that much. It's just an interesting thing to note.
Well, there's always a balance, and you want to keep friends on the other side of the chamber, so in the other chamber. So if there's a bill you want that might be sticky over there, you don't want to burn any bridges. And this bill doesn't really apply to the Senate, like you said. So I think that there's just a political calculation to be made that, you know what, not my yard, not my problem.
Now, Brad, as you had mentioned before, the teacher walkout kind of changed the whole atmosphere of this whole legislative session, and there were a lot of bills that we thought were going to be a really big deal that just ended up dying along the way. Now, one of this was the business inventory tax, which I know you had covered as well. What was your view on that?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about, right, is the phase out of
that.
The property tax that is applied to industrial manufacturers. Well, yeah, so Governor Justice called that the Just Cut Taxes and Win, I think, resolution in his State of the State. But, you know, it ran up against the teacher issue in a practical way and in a symbolic way. It was a phase out, but the total amount was $140 million over 7 years. Potentially would have gone to voters in November as a constitutional amendment. But the fact that it was viewed as, and frankly was, a corporate tax cut, and the $140 million figure, again spaced out over 7 years, but $140 million up against the teachers and the pay raise really looked like, you know, is the scale balanced too much in favor of a corporate tax cut versus teachers who can make a compelling argument that they need to be paid better?
Now, Ryan, I know another one is the community college bill. It didn't make it through, did it?
No, the bill actually, Senate President Carmichael actually was pushing this bill, but it seems like it's actually been lost because they were trying to find funding for the actual teacher pay raises. It was only $7 million, perhaps $8 million, and it's gone by the wayside. And I think that's an interesting situation because I think Carmichael may have lost a lot of ground with educators amidst all of this reluctance to actually pass the 5% raise. And then he lost this community college free tuition bill, which could have actually helped salvage some of his education credentials.
And Brad, there was also the question of the intermediate courts as well, which was also lost along the way.
Yeah, that passed the Senate, and boy, I went to a lot of meetings and it all came to nothing. But that's something that's been debated, frankly, since the Manchin years. Like 2009, there was a task force recommended West Virginia do an intermediate court of appeals. This year, there seemed to be some emphasis to try to do it on the Senate side. Went to the House, and no action was really taken. And it's something that you have to think the legislature didn't go forward because either at the $3 million mark that the Senate said it would be, or the $12 million mark that the Supreme Court itself said that court might cost. It was just unaffordable.
So one thing that did come out of that teacher walkout, of course, is the PEIA task force. Let's take a listen to what Senator Beach had to say earlier about that membership.
Agenda today. But, Mr. President, I want to take a moment to address just the men of the Senate today. And as you're aware, the governor released the list of names for the members of the PEIA task force. And I would like to read that list of names to you, please. Marty, Greg, Andy, Joe, Rob, Nelson, Perry, Mitch, Robert, Craig, Eric, Roger, Mick, Jeff, Dale, Joe, Raul, Douglas, Michael, and Jeffrey. Now, perhaps for my more enlightened Senate members, you quickly catch on to what's missing from that list. And for those of you who lack that enlightenment, let me help you out. That's all men. There's only 2 women on the whole list. Now, certainly, that's probably just a small oversight of our governor. Because why would a man who coaches a girls' basketball team only appoint 2 women to a panel that impacts women's health care and children's health care? So, Mr. President, what I have done, I have prepared a letter that I plan to sign, and I'm going to ask each man in this room to sign, that basically it's one sentence, Mr. President. Senate members hereby request the governor, the executive, to amend Executive Order number 6-18, which establishes the 28-member PEIA task force, to appoint 6 additional women prior to its first meeting on March 13th. That's all it does. And I'm asking each of you to join me. I'll put the first signature on. Mr. President, I'm going to walk it to your desk and ask you for a signature as well. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Seems to have heard Senator Beach loud and clear, and just recently added 6 women to the PEIA task force. So
this just in.
Yeah, this just happened. He got it.
And that was up from 2 women, correct?
Yes, there were 2 women on there previously. So now the task force has gone to 23 to 29, which raises another question that Brad posed earlier. How the heck are you going to get 29 people to agree on health care?
That's almost as big as the Senate itself.
Now, one interesting thing to note, too, is just the teachers walkout in general. It was predominantly women in that group. Ryan, would you mind talking about that? Just how it was a female-driven, maybe not a female-driven, but it was predominantly females who were involved in that.
Yeah, and maybe that's also a poor reflection on how we need to get more men as well into the teaching profession.
I'm feeling like we should ask you. Yeah. Can we turn it on you?
But no, there was certainly, and one of the leaders of the state union, Christine Campbell, who's of AFT West Virginia, is also seems to be a talented speaker and can fire up a crowd. And so yeah, that was certainly a apparent a feature of the actual strike and the strike force. And I think this addition of these members to the PIA task force, and people were, before the actual task force executive order was written, people was like, who's going to be on this thing? Who's going to be on this thing? It was actually a big point of contention, and I think this will actually help solve some of those concerns, because that was one of the first concerns raised. It's like there's only 2 women on this thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, switching gears to something that happened earlier today, there was a cyberbullying bill in the Senate. Let's take a listen to what Senator Arvon had to say about that.
I rise in support of this bill, and I have a newfound passion for this topic, as myself and several others in this body have been the brunt of cyberbullying in the last few weeks. Let me be clear, the bullying came mostly from others, not our teachers. But unfortunately, there were a few teachers who I didn't know personally that decided to engage in this behavior. That was very alarming to me and discouraging. It has been said that West Virginia was an example of how to protest appropriately and peacefully. And while I agree that outwardly our state seemed to be a beacon to others, behind our cell phones and computer screens lurked damaging, degrading, and threatening behavior by adults that shook me to the core. Mr. President, I support this bill, but feel that we need to go even further in our protections of all people and to protect.
And that bill was passed by the Senate earlier today. Now, another bill that I think all of us have been watching, at least to some extent, was this medical cannabis bill. Jake, can you just explain to me about this?
Right, so the House sent some changes over at the request of the Medical Cannabis Advisory Board. There were a few changes. One prominent one is that it allows businesses to act as any combination of growers, processors, and dispensers. So it's been called vertical integration, and it gives them more control of the supply chain. What was noticeably absent from the board's recommendations was dry leaf marijuana. And right now you can get, or I suppose cannabis would be the term, but you can get cannabis in a host of different forms in almost everything but the dry leaf form. Now that bill was sent over to the Senate, and a committee amendment says, well, there is no dry leaf form yet. It instructs the board to promulgate the legislative rule, so it would still be subject to legislative approval, but generally if those get out of the Rules Committee, they tend to get passed on the floor. Now, just earlier today, that bill was laid over until tomorrow, so if it doesn't make it out of the Senate, and then those changes be reconciled in the House, which has been a little more sticky with marijuana, it could be dead for the session. So that's probably something to pay attention to tomorrow.
Right. And Brad, all eyes are on the budget for tonight. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think they'll argue about it, but as Chairman Nelson and Delegate Bates acknowledged, it's primed for passage pretty much in record time. It's very disappointing to me because I'm accustomed to being here in June with you guys, but we're going to have to make other plans and cover other things. There's at least usually a 3 to 5 day extension just to deal with the budget after the regular session, but it appears that this budget is going to be on pace probably to pass tomorrow, with the biggest thing that people would argue about having been the teacher pay raise, and we think that's in the rearview mirror.
Right. I mean, like you said, that's a very unusual thing, too, because usually there is this extended budget session, and it does look like they're going to finish this tomorrow.
Right, yeah.
Now, Brad, I know you've also been covering two of the constitutional amendments. Can you just briefly go over this judicial budget oversight amendment that was passed today by the House?
Oh yeah, that seems like forever ago. That was the first thing the House took up this morning, and seemed like the biggest issue coming in here was how was the legislature going to react to these controversial furniture purchases? They are exerting their right to oversee the judiciary branch's budget.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Again, we have Ryan Quinn, Jake Zuckerman, and Brad McElhenney.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And this concludes our special extended coverage of the legislature today on the 59th day of the session. Our final day coverage starts early tomorrow on the West Virginia channel and then picks up with a special live broadcast of the legislature today beginning at 8 p.m. Governor Jim Justice will join us here at the set to reflect on the session and his legislative agenda. For West Virginia Public Broadcasting, I'm Andrea Lanham. Thanks for joining us and have a great evening.